Hi, Kate.
Hi, how are you
So great.
over there?
I'm good. Firstly, thank you so much for agreeing to do this today. It's very generous of you and thoughtful to spend the time with us.
No, thank you. I mean, adult conversation. I, I'm craving it. So
Firstly, where are you calling from?
I'm in the country in the south of England, in the UK. And with our pigs and chickens and rain.
So as I discussed with you, we're going to generate a series of very open-ended and general questions that's been compiled by myself and the students, and you can answer them as you wish, if at all.
Is it a kind of a Rorschach test, an aesthetic Rorschach? Ah, okay. Do I check in with you once a week to see if my answers have changed?
Well, we could do that. we could do that. Okay, so are you ready?
Yeah.
First question is, what is your most vivid memory from childhood?
Gosh, vivid or early?
Either.
I think probably, I think my earliest memory, and I can judge this from time, it's a perspective of memory. I think my father died when I was 10. And so he had a heart attack when he was 32, and I'd never seen him in bed. And I know, sometimes you, the older you get, you don't know whether what you remember from your childhood is crafted out of anecdote and photographic memory, or whether it's an actual real memory, or whether it's actually, the further you get from your childhood, whether it's bound up with your dreams and any sort of sentimental recollections you have of your childhood. But this one I know actually happened because of where I was in the room. And my father was a workaholic who was always at work, and I'd never seen him in bed. And so I can see him in bed from here. And so I know how high is a bed. I must have been 18 months because now having children, I know my head was just above the mattress. So that's a very strong memory. And I think probably because it's of my father, and a lot of my memories of my father, I think, have been crafted out of, but I have a very strong visual memory, actually. In Australia, I'm Australian, and we used to go on a lot of road trips, before everyone was flying everywhere. And the distances in Australia are enormous, and it's a long, unlike America, you'll drive somewhere and you'll hit another town. You drive for hours and you wouldn't see another person. And I used to get terribly, terribly car sick. And I remember the only thing that would stop the car sickness is looking out of the window, and I would focus on they have these brilliant, endless blue skies, and I'd see the crisscrossing of the electrical wires, and then you'd hit a telegraph pole, and then the wires, even though they were running in parallel, there was something about the movement of the car that meant that they would crisscross, and it just seemed like it was always I would always mark my journey by the movement of these wires. So that's
it's very photographic, both images. Who were your early influences when you were coming of age?
Who are my early influences? Nancy Drew, Trixie Belden. Used to buy those in the supermarket. Girl detectives. I lived kind of in an outer suburb in Melbourne, and I would spend a lot of my weekend on bikes, passing sort of discarded mattresses down by the river, and I would invent these murders that had happened there that I just had to solve. So I think it was probably girl detectives. But do you mean aesthetic influences, or?
Either, however you want to approach it.
I remember being really startled by, really startled by and I don't think I should have seen the film as early as I did, but I saw a film, Australian film called Wake in Fright, and it was about an English school teacher who was dreaming about going to the coast, and he was in the desert, and he got involved in a two-up game. They say Australians will bet on anything, and he lost all his money. And the book, it's 100 pages. It's amazing. I read the book subsequently, but the whole film was like a horrific nightmare. And I think after seeing that, in my childhood, I watched so much horror. So I think the horror movie actually, and maybe it's to do with my father's death, I don't know, but I watched a lot. I was very obsessed with images of death and tribal images of death, and maybe to try and understand that, I don't know. But it was, a lot of horror.
Is there a particular movie that you feel changed your life, or perhaps?
Oliver Reed was in a film, it changed my life. Oh
Yes,
gosh, that's a massive one. I was still on the horror bent.
Well, maybe it's a horror film that changed your life.
What was one I saw really early on? I remember at school, in the school hall, must have been I was quite open that first year of school, because you're so exposed, and it was a very large school and I didn't know anyone, and so the memories from that first year of school are quite vivid. But I remember seeing Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, and I think because it was projected so large, and at that stage I didn't go to the cinema very often, the test pattern on the television is a massive memory of mine. That moment when you were so engaged with something, and all of a sudden the dreams and memories stopped, and you think it was some mystical thing, like a television. The test pattern contained, where have those dreams gone? Where have those thoughts gone? And it was, and I'd often go down in the middle of the night to see the test pattern was there. But anyway, so I didn't go to the cinema that often, and so to see this, and because it was badly projected, I think it was like a Ken Russell film. It was very blurry and so romantic, and I found the obviously the score was so sweeping, and the images were it was like Millet's Ophelia underwater, and so sort of pre-Raphaelite, and I was swept away by the language. So probably that one, I guess. Well, that's the one that comes to mind now.
Do you feel your work is autobiographical in any sense?
I hope not. Gosh.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, only in the sense that I couldn't be less interested in myself. I find this sort of, apart from talking to you, I'd rather hear your answers to these questions than mine. In the sense that I mean, there will be detritus from your dream life and your daily musings that end up in your work, and I guess the product of what you end up choosing to focus on reveals your rolling nature of your thoughts, and also I do find that one project often is the antidote or the equal and opposite reaction to what you've done before. So, but it's funny though, the more you do, there is a kind of propensity, I think, in public discourse about film actors or theatre actors, or maybe not so much novelists, and I don't know if you find this as a photographer, but that the people try and place what are often very random decisions and thread a kind of an artistic autobiography that you're completely unconscious of.
Right.
But maybe in some way, but not in any conscious way, I don't think.
What is the least favorite part of the artistic process for you? The part you like the least?
I hate saying no to things. I really hate saying no to things. The least favorite, I think it's that terrible. Speaking about waking up at 3 a.m, for me, I think it's that moment when, and it happens not so much in theatre, but it certainly happens for me in film, is that you will wake up 2 or 3 months after you've done it, and sometimes on the last day of filming, and go, oh my God, that was the very thing that I forgot to do. And then sometimes you try and rectify that or amplify that, or give life to that thought in the post-production process, although certain directors don't even have that, or some projects don't have the luxury of that. But I think it's the letting go.
What is the part you like the best?
I like a lot of it, actually. Well, I mean, when I first started out, I think I liked rehearsals more than I liked performance, and I think I grew to like performance more. This isn't the theatre, but I love that moment when you're all together in the rehearsal room, which is such a kind of an elastic, intimate, impolite cocoon that you've worked for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, however long you've had. And then you all step out, you pack up everything, and you step out into the theatre, and you go into the technical rehearsal. And so you breathe in on stage the kind of the history of the space, you're suddenly in the space, and I love a proscenium arch. You're in the frame that people are going to see you, and the lights have been put up, and you begin to imagine what it's going to be like to have an audience there. And I think what I like most about it, and what I do try and continue on with, keep this knowledge alive, is that the process is an experiment. So often some of the biggest discoveries happen because no one's looking at you on as they have been trying to craft the thing in the rehearsal room, as they will do in the dress rehearsal and the previews. So they're looking at the lights, and you stop, and you start to really play with the actors, because you're playing with light, and you're really playing with space, and you're playing with height, and you're playing with distance in a way that you don't fully do in the rehearsal room, but you are truly playing with it. And I always, like, it's like being at a sleepover, and your parents keep coming in and telling you, you've got to go to bed, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and the things that you talk about, they're the things that you remember about that friendship, and so I think it's the camaraderie that you really build, but it's the creative discoveries that you make when you're simply playing, and you've got no sense of consequence, because you'll get to the dress rehearsal when you're meant to craft the thing, and often the leaps that the production makes in that space. And for me, working in film, I try and keep that process alive, because oftentimes, the most creative part of the process in film is the pre-production. It's the costume fittings. It's those kind of open-ended conversations that you have before the real things, starts to take place, where you have to get serious about it, and to keep alive the sense that the thing's an experiment. There's no right answer to this. This is just what we do now,
Preference between theater and movies? That unfair question.
I think for me, I've been fortunate to move between the two mediums, and they, I think I know now, having stepped away from theatre for 5 or 6 years, and then we went back and we ran the de facto National Theatre in Australia for a decade. Having stepped away, I think I returned to those larger spaces, knowing how to use, trying to keep the notion of the intimacy of a close-up with an audience. And then consequently, having had a background in theatre, I think I was very just naturally aware of how you could use a wide shot. They couldn't see your face, but what you could express in silhouette with a hand, or, and I was very grateful for having that. I hate to say classical training, because it sounds very old-fashioned, and I think I'm much more Germanic in my tastes than the sense of traditional British theatre. But I learned a lot by being in that proscenium arch.
Who's your imagined audience? Is that something you think about?
I don't know. I'm always seeking different audiences, I think. Or never look, to be honest. I mean, I'm relatively shy, I think, probably. The only way I can get up and do it is, which is a bit hard in theatre when you're working in a 2,000-seat auditorium, but I have to imagine that no one is going to see it. And as I convince myself so absolutely about that. So I'm making it with people that are making it. Hopefully, not in a Grotowski-esque way that, you know, it doesn't matter if no one goes to see it. Of course you want people to see it. You know, it's not a self-indulgent, it's not navel-gazing. But I think it's, you know, for me, I like speaking to lots of different audiences. I think it keeps my sense of what is possible a little bit more elastic, rather than always speaking to the same group of people.
What work of art or movie has made you cry?
Oh, I cry a lot. The natural world makes me cry, just with its sheer beauty, you know, the notion of the sublime. I think, well, I mean, do you mean visual arts or films, or it's anything? I think Terence Davies, his films, you know, the Long Day Closes. For me, I mean, I love his work. I think he's the most astonishing director. And there's a moment in there which, for me, synthesizes another thing that makes me cry, which is choral music. So the unaccompanied human voice. Oh, I could cry just thinking about it. And there's a moment where Kathleen Ferrier is singing "Blow the Wind Southerly," and this young boy from Liverpool in the 50s is sitting at his school desk, and he's you know, he's obviously incredibly artistic, but the world around him is not feeding that, or he's not being embraced by it. And he's sitting at his desk, and the lights go down on him, and he's suddenly transported by this music that's in his head. And he looks out, and you see he's singing "Blow the Wind Southerly," and so the boat is going by, and he's drenched in the spray that's purely from his imagination. That makes me weep. And also, I mean, recently, what made me weep was, relatively recently, was Denis Villeneuve's Arrival. Hammershøi makes me weep. You know, those gaps in space. Bergman makes me weep. But yeah, Hammershøi an open window in a Hammershøi painting can make you weep.
Love that.
Yeah.
How has success affected your work?
Gosh, I mean, success is such a strange thing, isn't it? I think maybe I don't tend to dwell on success. I think far more about failure. I think it's far more useful.
Good, because that's my next question.
Oh, okay. I'll get to failure. Then we could talk about failure for hours. How success has affected my work. I think, you know what, one of the biggest changes, I think, is the way people speak to you about your work. Suddenly your voice is louder, and you can often feel like you're in an echo chamber. And sadly, I think often what happens is that people can assume that you won't do certain things. And I think you have to become increasingly more robust and brutal with yourself, because people around you want you to take risks less, or they feel you've arrived somewhere, which I think is just rubbish. And I mean, it's the enemy of creating anything, the notion of arriving. So yes, it's probably the difference in the way people speak to you, I guess. But I don't know. And so yes, maybe that's negatively affected my work. I don't know.
What have you learned through failure?
I think the biggest lessons I've learned are through failure. It's like, you know, you learn, you grow new wings, you get stronger through it. You work out, because often, you know, it's that wabi sabi thing, you know, that it's the flaw that makes things beautiful. So I think you learn to exist with failure. Not that you seek failure out, but within failure means that you've actually risked something. Right. And I think risk is so important. And it's, you know, it's continuing to take those risks, I think, that are you know, vitally important. And you could say through, you know, I won't do that again. But in a way you go, well, I will do that again, but I want to try and make it work that time. Yeah.
What is your favorite guilty pleasure?
My favorite guilty pleasure. I don't think pleasure's guilty at all. What's my guilty pleasure? It used to be the crappy magazines that you'd get in hairdressing salons. My grandmother, who I grew up with, used to go to this hairdressing salon, you know, in the suburbs of Melbourne, called Ezio of Rome. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, you know, I don't think Ezio had ever been to Rome, but the magazines there were so salacious, you know. And I think that was probably my guilty pleasure. It's, you know, and I think it's when I was at university, I used to waitress, and I used to I found this spot in this one job I had that was, I used to fold napkins. They used to say, why are you folding so many napkins? But I would eavesdrop on people's dinner table conversation and the silences. And that was a real guilty pleasure, I think. It wasn't something I admitted to, but you know, a friend of mine actually we wrote a piece for our drama major based on these overheard conversations.
What is your greatest fear?
I think it's not having enough time. You know, but you know, it's that's probably bound up in death. But I think artistically, I remember reading this story about Giacometti, that he had been apart from his girlfriend at the time for about 4 years because of the war. And he said, I'm working on this really important piece of work. And he came back with, I don't know, about 6 matchboxes full of dust. And he'd been trying to perfect something so absolutely that he'd crushed it. And that it was just matchboxes full of dust. And I think in the desire to, sometimes, you know, in the desire to get things right, you can kill it. And that's always a fear of mine, you know, just, but it's probably not having enough time, you know, apart from the death of those who I love. Dying second. That's maybe a fear of mine.
Well, my last question, and then if you have time, we'll take a few questions from the students. What advice would you give the students in this moment of peril? I don't know. I mean, courage is always really important, isn't it? But I mean, I think, in a way, I think artists are more equipped to deal with moments of peril, because there's nothing more perilous than an empty page or an empty canvas or an empty head.
you know, where we face peril all the time, like creative peril all the time. And of course, it's a pandemic, and there's physical, you know, there's so many people suffering and in genuine and real fear. But I think it's been interesting, you know, a lot of friends who are saying, you know, will you read this? Will you do this? And I think it's really important to reach out, you know, and so these meetings that you're holding are really important because you've got to keep the conversation going, and random conversation, you know, it's so hard we were just saying before, you know, for chance meetings, chance conversations to happen. And often that's where, you know, but I think the most important thing is to not be frightened of silence and to sit with your own thoughts, and that if you emerge from this time having been fallow in the sense that you haven't produced anything, that is okay, because sometimes it's important to listen and absorb, and then sometimes it's important to produce. And I think we live in a society, a creative society, where it's about output. And I've noticed that there's a low-lying panic in a lot of creative people, because we need one another and we need the conversation. And of course we want that to continue. But also I think that we feel we're going to be judged on what we've done with the time. And sometimes it's actually moving away from your central discipline and simply sitting with your own thoughts. Did I send you that Tarkovsky thing?
No. Please.
Oh, there was a friend sent, maybe they were trying to, a friend sent it to me, a painter in Australia, Tarkovsky. He's sitting in a tree. I'm a huge Tarkovsky fan. And he was saying, you know, young people today shouldn't be frightened of silence, shouldn't be frightened of sitting with their own thoughts. And he was talking about this aggressive nature of production. And it's a really interesting little clip. It ends with a beautiful, strange picture of a horse, which actually I had a recurring nightmare about a horse and a test pattern growing up. So, you know, it stayed with me for many reasons.
Please.
But look, advice is terrible. I mean, you know, because in the end, it's all there.
Beautiful, beautiful advice. So are you up for a few questions?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, the first one is from Alex.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for talking today. Hi. I've been thinking a lot recently about your performance in I'm Not There. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you access or inhabit characters that you play, particularly those that are based on a real person.
Good question.
Well, in that particular instance, Todd Haynes approached me. It wasn't like I was sitting in my bedroom thinking, God, I'd love to play Dylan.
Yeah.
It wasn't a thought that I'd had. And so I said to Todd, I said, what are you talking about? And of course, Todd is one of these, and I so respond to directors like this, and Todd is the quintessential one. He came with a huge mood board, and a playlist, and I understood the cinematic endeavor and how I could slot into it. So it was an ask from the outside. But I had a very strange time and pretty close to a panic attack, actually, was almost not going to do the film because I was in the middle of playing Elizabeth I, and I knew I had to lose quite a lot of weight for Dylan, so I was probably a bit out of my head. But I was playing Elizabeth I, and every lunchtime, because I literally walked off the set of that film, The Golden Age, on Saturday morning, because we did a night shoot, flew with my kids and my husband to Montreal and started filming on the Monday with Bob Dylan. And I thought, I can't do this. And so every lunchtime I was going through the outtakes from the Pennybaker documentary to try and understand his energy and so it was quite obsessive, but I am obsessed with him in a lot of ways. But I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That's great.
Rory.
Hi. Oh my gosh. Hi.
Hi, how are you? Oh, what's that cat behind you?
Oh, it's a painting, but I have a real cat right here too.
Oh, you do? Where is it?
Dark. I'll show you him. There he is. He's sleeping.
Oh, hey.
Anyway, I have a similar question. I was going to ask, as an actor with your artistic process, what are the conversations you have with the directors and the writers, both in theater and film, to sort of go beyond the role and sort of fill out the whole production? Because so much is your artistic process meets their artistic process. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean a lot of these decisions are made, to embark on instinct, and I usually gravitate towards those creative asks that are surprising and asks that I would never have thought of myself. And it's, for me, the biggest joy is the conversation, with the other actors, with the writer. Often in film, it's the seventh writer, who's finally on set. But for me, a lot of it happens. I love it. A lot of those decisions get made in things like costume fittings and camera tests, and Soderbergh does this thing which I think is great, where he doesn't rehearse at all. He barely does a take, but he has dinners with people, and so people can get to know one another, so that they're not talking one-to-one with the material. They're just getting to know one another's, rhythm, really, and snipping each other's little creative bottoms, so to speak. So I think it's often when you talk around the work, because in film everyone has such a different process. And one of the best lessons I learnt in theatre is, of course, you can sit around a table and you can talk about what you're going to do, and you can break down the text, and you can talk about the ideas, and you can look at the costumes, the set models sitting over there. But then what you have to do is you have to get out of your chair and you have to stand in an empty space, and you have to be fucking embarrassed. And I was working the very first job I got out of drama school was I got to understudy someone at the Sydney Theatre Company, and this grand dame of the theatrical world was playing one of the parts, and she was doing all this stuff that she was sort of talking into a script. And I asked her later, and she said, "Oh, I do that on day one and day two, so that people will think I don't know what I'm doing, and they'll leave me alone, or they'll be so busy thinking about how they're going to recast that I can actually work." And the other great lesson I learned too is that about getting out of your chair and just giving it a go, is that that it's great when at the end of the week you say, put your scripts aside, if you know your lines or not, I'll call them out to you, we're just going to move in space and just see what happens. And I think it's the getting out of your chair and starting. It's one of the hardest parts, I think.
Thank you.
Annie.
Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Such a pleasure having you.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, a little bit of a different track. I was wondering, what does magic mean to you? Just in thinking of like so much work you've done. And also I'm just curious what role it plays, not just in your work, but also how you experience the world.
You mean magic as in those little miracles, those little surprising miracles, or I think whenever I think of magic, it's always got to do with those moments which where the moment that you're in somehow connects to the moment that you've left and the moment that you're going to enter. And I think it's when we spend a lot of our time being self-conscious, and I think it's that moment when self-consciousness leaves you. When you're having a great conversation with someone, or and it's somehow the thing is hovering between you, and I think that's probably magic, that no one's holding it. It's just it's to do with flow. I mean, I think about you know, some of the best nights I've ever had creatively, artistically as an audience member, when I'm watching dance. People, you know, it's that moment when people lift off the suspension before they land. That's magic, I think.
So we have time
because, you know, it's that moment where you think people can fly.
We have time for one last question, and it goes to Mickey.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was just wondering, like, are there any kind of current movements or trends happening that you see happening right now in either cinema or television that really kind of excites you?
In cinema or television? I'll be curious to see what comes out of this whole direct nature of communication that we're having. I think there's been a lot of impediments between makers of work and their audience, layers of sort of artifice and discourse that has affected in a way the type of work that gets made and seen, and the type of work and the way that gets developed. And we seem to be having much more direct communication broadly, and I think that could lead to exciting ways of actually developing work. So enabling people, for instance, who would not be able to travel somewhere, who couldn't make it into a so-called writer's room, or allowing people of different disciplines to exist in the same space. I think it's going to affect the potential of the way we can actually develop things, I think. But I'll be very interested. I've had a lot of people say to me, you know, have been really passionately developing projects, and they've been saying, I don't know if this is entirely relevant now. So I think this experience, if we're sensible, can shift our aesthetics and shift our sense of what stories we are interested in telling. Like, for instance, I've been thinking a lot about folk art and land art. I know that doesn't answer your question in terms of cinema, but I also think, you know, when people were starting on digital, there was I remember when we did The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, everyone was levelling the criticism at David Fincher that the work was cold. I don't agree, but there's something about digital that can lend itself to excess, because you can just keep working, and you don't have to self-censor in the way that you have to when you're working on celluloid or hard film. But I think it's people are beginning to I think have lived with these technologies for long enough to begin to master the possibilities of them, and I think that's really exciting, rather than just experimenting for its own sake.
Do you think there'll be movie theaters at the end of all this?
I think people are going to crave the live. I, for one, you know, I think there might be a lot of open air cinemas. I think people are going to want fresh air and big visions. I think we've all been in little boxes in one another's screens, and I think we're going to want to see big canvases, you know, which I think is really, really, really exciting.
Well, on that note, I'm going to ask all the students from what looks to be around the world, because we have 1,000 viewers here, but I'm going to ask them all to put on their, which essentially is breaking Zoom, I think, at the moment. So I want all the students to put on their screen and audio so we could give Kate a rousing applause. So I want all the students to put on their screen and audio so we could give Kate a rousing applause.
Beautiful. Beautiful.